Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad that I have the opportunity to meet you at this pre-recorded final panel of our conference. We have decided to dedicate the final day of conference to the theme of interpreting, and I'm very honored that I have the opportunity to welcome very interesting guests to cover the topic of how the interpreting profession has been transformed over the last 18 months and what implications has the digital transformation on the profession of interpreters. We have called this table discussion or roundtable discussion interpreters in a digital landscape, new norms, standards, and the possibilities of defining them. And I have the honor to welcome Dr. Raquel Lázaro-Gutiérrez from the Modern Philology Department of the University of Alcalá, who is a well-known scholar focusing on public service interpreting with a special focus on medical settings. So she's a well-known and highly cited scholar, I have to add. And the second guest that I have the honor to welcome is Jonathan Downie, one of the troublesome Terps, a consultant interpreter, Scotsman, business interpreter, researcher, speaker on interpreting, and an author of a book that I have to recommend to everyone, Interpreters versus Machines. Well, he wrote more books, but this is the most recent one I've read. And we'll also touch upon some of your concepts that you mentioned in your book and the implications the pandemic had on the fight between interpreters and the machines. So we have witnessed an unprecedented transformation of the interpreting profession. I tell to my students that the last 18 months have perhaps transformed the profession of interpreters in the same way as the Nuremberg processes have transformed interpreting in the 40s, that we will be dividing, looking in the hindsight on the interpreting profession before the pandemic and after the pandemic. It is difficult to predict which trends will be lasting, but we can already see that some changes will remain, especially the transition towards the digital landscape. So if we can start with your first thoughts, what would you say, or what in your idea will be the most lasting impacts of the COVID pandemic and the shift to digital for the interpreters? And let's start with you, Raquel. In the field of public service interpreting, what do you predict the most lasting changes and the deepest transformation of the profession?
Well, as you may know, actually public service interpreting is very popular in telephone interpreting. So the provision for public service interpreting has already gone that step forward towards distance remote interpreting. So I think this has at least given us the opportunity to lose that fear, because in certain settings within public service interpreting, there was a kind of fear by service providers about distance interpreting. And actually, now that we're still almost all of us telecommuting and that service provision is being done remotely, it is a natural thing that interpreters are also remote. And this was already being done. So it is not that interpreters do not have the training, or I think we have already overcome all those barriers. So interpreters are well prepared. Telephone interpreting is possible. So this is giving us the opportunity actually to encourage more service providers to include remote interpreting. And I also think that this has been a perfect opportunity to foster video conference interpreting, which was missing in many areas, in many settings. For example, in medical interpreting, it was not used. And right now it's been, well, it was not so used as in other settings, in other public service settings. And now there are many services, many medical services, which are offering video conferencing interpreting and who are at least trying it. So I think it is going to be a good opportunity. This is just speeding up the natural process that we were already undergoing. So it is not so bad.
Indeed, and you're right about that, that telephone interpreting was actually highly developed in the field of or more developed in the field of public service interpreting, as we will compare it with conference interpreting in a while. But do you think that the whole profession, especially the medical setting profession, was it prepared to adopt new standards and new forms of interpreting immediately after the onset of the pandemic, or did it take time in order for new, especially video conference interpreting, to settle in?
Well, I would say that for telephone interpreting, it was just done. I mean, there was no need to adapt. Perhaps some interpreters who had not so much experience in telephone interpreting because they were doing on-site presential interpreting, perhaps they had to adapt, but it is just a matter of, I think, individual interpreters, because there are already many who were delivering interpreting over the phone. So I think that if we consider the whole situation as a whole, it is actually not so disrupting for telephone interpreting. For video conference interpreting, well, it is considered to be an improvement regarding telephone interpreting, so an improvement in the remote provision of interpreting services, because it adds visual information. Of course, it is. It's been said that it is cognitively more demanding because you also have to concentrate on visual cues, but actually, well, it is a matter of getting used to it, because, well, usually everything which we do that we are not used to, it is cognitively demanding. I think we've all experienced this, no matter our activity, no matter our job. When we started telecommuting, it was very demanding for us, and by the end of the day, we were exhausted. And perhaps some of us right now that we are going back to our physical offices, we are experiencing right now that feeling again, that we get very, very tired by the end of the day. And these were the things we were doing before the pandemic. It is just that we have already adapted to telecommuting, and when we go back to on-site working, then it is hard again. So, well, of course, it is going to be harder, perhaps it is harder for more experienced interpreters who have had all those years of expertise working on sites. But for those who are starting, they are more used to do interpreting over the phone than on-site interpreting.
This is a very good point, actually, because even looking at the field of conference interpreters, myself being a conference interpreter, I can see that my younger colleagues or colleagues who haven't spent, let's put it this way, several decades providing conference interpreting, but are reasonably new on the market, adopted the digital transformation almost automatically. For them, it was a no-brainer. It happened from one week to another. But I can see that for colleagues who have been accustomed to the standard booth and the standard provision of interpreting, the digital transformation was much more of a challenge, let's put it this way. Jonathan, when I read your book, The Interpreters versus Machines, it was deep in the pandemic. This was March or April last year. And I kept wondering that, because it was published just before the pandemic. Yep. So to what extent you actually had an idea that something so deeply disruptive is coming? And I have to say that the book stood the test of the pandemic, because it is still valid even after the experience of the pandemic. So you outlined 4 different scenarios of the possible development vis-a-vis artificial intelligence and computers interpreting instead of humans. How do you think the pandemic changed the situation of the struggle between interpreters and machines?
I think I wanted to reframe the struggle, and I think if I were to go back to rewrite it, I would probably write more about the partnership. I think there is a chapter about, calling a truce and say, we need to look at partnership. And I think the pandemic has really shown that partnership is going to be the way ahead. The biggest impact for me on conference interpreting has been what I would like to label just now conceptual leakage. So drawing a line between conference interpreting and between business interpreting and even sometimes bilingual voiceover is becoming very, very difficult, because basically we're using the same techniques, using the same technology from the same place. So I was consulting on a conference recently where my advice to the client was to use translation and voiceover. They insisted on using interpreting because they wanted it to sound interpreted, which is an interesting approach anyway. And I realized that actually, in terms of equipment, in terms of preparation, the lines were very, very blurry anyway. Apart from the fact, because the interpreters could take as many passes as they want because it was pre-recorded. And I think the pandemic has really underlined the importance of clients knowing the value that we produce. If we can't justify to clients why we're worth X number of hundred, name your currency, then they don't have to use us anymore. They don't even have to call the meeting anymore. And I also think that we have to rethink how we price and sell conference interpreting, because in my market, certainly, we were used to, this is the amount per day. If you're in a really good mood, there might be a half day rate if it's really local, and if it finishes before or after a certain time. But what if you get your favorite client who calls you up and says, Jonathan, I really need you for an hour? You can try to justify a half day rate, and in many cases it is justified. But by the same token, try explaining to a client that they're paying the same to have you there for 45 minutes as they would for a whole day. It doesn't make sense to them. And so trying to rethink how we work with clients, how we approach pricing, what we even label our services anymore. I have a paper which came out last year, a follow-up coming out whenever the reviewers okay my corrections, arguing that interpreting is interpreting. We know we're used to working with these categories, and for me the pandemic has really wiped them out. And so I would say I'm glad the book has stood the test of time. I'm glad it is very relevant. I would say there's now an added layer of thinking into the mix, which is, what do we use the technology for? How do we prove our value using the technology? And how do we make sure that the technology is always the servant and never the master? I think our mistake during the pandemic is we allowed the technology to drive the conversation. And it was, we have to do this, so how do we do it? And that's an understandable conversation. We never really did get round to the conversation of, well, what can we use this for afterwards? And I think we need to have that conversation, which is, we have now the technology to do remote interpreting. We have remote simultaneous studios popping up all around the world. When is that the best technology to use, and when should we be in person? And until we're ready to have that conversation and have it honestly, I think we're going to miss out on the biggest potential for the profession to grow and for us to grow as people after the pandemic.
Well, thank you, because there's one very interesting line that I'd like to develop, namely that the lines or the division between traditional public service interpreting, conference interpreting, business interpreting have blurred. As you're right, we are all sitting at home with our nice top and perhaps with just our sweatpants below the table, and there's no difference whether you are serving the ministerial conference or whether you are supporting a patient in a hospital. Basically, the method of delivering is the same. But you also mentioned that there is a transformation vis-a-vis the rates, vis-a-vis the traditional communication between a client and an interpreter. I think that this period is a chance to redefine the relations between the client. You are right, because the paradigms that have been valid for decades on, I don't know, that always 2 interpreters in a booth, 3 interpreters if this is a large language regime, in case of conference interpreting, that this is the standard rate, that we never accept hourly rates, etc. All of this is now wobbly because the paradigm has changed. To what extent do you think the further fragmentation of the profession, because in the past the interpreters would talk together in the corridors. They would be able to push for their common interests through different delegations and negotiations. But now everyone is isolated at home. We can talk about digital isolation. To what extent will the position of interpreters be more undermined in the future, given this isolation? And to what extent do you think we have a chance to improve the conditions for interpreters?
There's two layers to this. I think the first layer is that our previous specialization according to settings is dead. And we should give it a nice funeral and walk away. And I think the specialization that we're going towards is specialization rather than by setting, specialization by domain. So I could see medical interpreters working on their simultaneous skills and doing anything medical, because it makes sense when you have, especially when you have in countries like the UK, where there's a high pressure on rates for traditional medical interpreting, there's a big pressure to push the rates down. It makes sense for those interpreters to, if you like, train as conference interpreters, although that's probably not a relevant term anymore, but so that they can do the medical conferences and the hospitals and the whatever. Similar with legal interpreters, there's no reason why they couldn't do an international law conference and so on if they get the training. So I think in that sense, the conditions of interpreters can improve if we think about specializing by domain or perhaps by client. I could see a lot of work coming up for interpreters who want to work for tech startups, for example. That's a different kind of skill. That's a different kind of approach. I could see a lot of interpreters saying, well, I tell you what, I'll work for these group of startups and whatever meeting they need, I'll be there. So in that sense, the kind of meeting in the corridor and negotiating no longer becomes relevant, because you're doing so many different types of meetings anyway, that you have to work out a pricing structure that works for all of them. On the other hand, I think we talk about isolation, and that has been the case. But I'd just like to point out that I'm in Edinburgh, Raquel's somewhere else, you're in Slovakia. We're having this conversation. We have this isolation, but we also have the means to reduce this isolation. And I think, again, it's a case of we're used to using the corridor, or a lot of conversations at conferences happen around the lunch table or outside the toilets. We just need to create other spaces that do that. And it may be that we need to create them more formally than we had before. You know, a conference like this, I can't grab Martin Jovchos in the corridor and ask him a question. I have his email address. I can send him a Zoom link. What am I doing? It's time to really think hard about how we do the digital version of catching someone in the corridor. I've had some wonderful conversations over Twitter that have gone into Zoom chats. Let's be millennials and find ways of breaking that isolation in any way that we can.
That's a very nice vision. Raquel, in case of public service interpreting, and I think that the proposal that Jonathan is making is very interesting, is very intriguing, of really actually training interpreters, not conference interpreters, public service interpreters. How do you see this angle? What's your perception on the level of transformation in the public service domain, public service interpreting domain, especially with respect to the most recent changes? And would you share his idea on just training interpreters specific or focused on a specific domain rather than a specific field of work?
Yes, of course, I totally agree with Jonathan. Actually, well, I know that Spain is not the most typical place of the world, perhaps, but actually in Spain, we've got master's degrees to train public service interpreters, and it happens that later on, they perform both as public service interpreters and as conference interpreters because they receive the training. It is not that, well, usually interpreters will receive training in conference interpreting, and then perhaps they have to do some public service interpreting. Well, public service interpreting, as you know, is underrated. So when this happens, usually those conference interpreters who have been trained as such feel frustrated. But well, this is not a matter of abilities, a matter of skills. It is a matter of payment, of many times of who your client is, because there are clients who can pay more and clients who pay less. And well, but I don't think skills are very different actually. And there are other paths, there are other ways, which, yeah, I understand that it is not the common path everywhere, but it happens. It happens in Spain, and it works. There are very good conference interpreters who have first been trained as public service interpreters. Of course, they have to follow further training, but it is not as if they had to do another master's degree. And the same happens with conference interpreters. Many of them, when they start doing bilateral interpreting, they feel very well, they feel that the skills that they have acquired are perhaps not enough, and they train further because changing, shifting all the time from one language to another is sometimes difficult. So yeah, some skills are going to be different, but some others are going to be very similar. And yeah.
Sorry. I could actually see interpreting training in the future following the example of legal and medical training, where you have a basic training and then you have a specialization period. I can't see conference interpreter training lasting for 7 years like the training of doctors, but I could see us having a foundation year where you cover interpreting and then a specialization year or however long. And that then answers a question I was criticized recently saying, are you saying that any interpreter can do anything? I said, no. But I am saying that every interpreter is an interpreter. And so perhaps our training should go to general training plus specialization. And I think, Raquel, that's really interesting that you have that model in Spain, because in the UK, for certain languages, the only interpreters we can get for conferences are public service interpreters. There aren't any conference interpreters trained in certain languages, certainly in Scotland. And so you have no other option. And the first time you throw a public service interpreter into, I don't know, a technical conference on cement or demolition, their eyes get really big. My funny story, that the first time I ever saw public service interpreters working at a conference, their biggest question was, all that food over there, are we allowed to eat it? Because, if they worked in the court, they would maybe get a sandwich and access to the coffee machine if they wanted to pay for it. Whereas in conference interpreting, we're used to it. There's a buffet, go eat. And so, yeah, I think we should be excited about the lines being blurred, and perhaps, I'm being slightly controversial here, allowing the lines to be blurred like that might be good for everyone, because public service interpreters might realize that there are clients who pay better, which then puts economic pressure on the ones who aren't, because if they can't find the interpreters, what are they going to do? And equally, it might expose conference interpreters to the fact that there are clients who pay worse. And so we shouldn't be divas and get annoyed if our water isn't exactly at 35 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever, because try working in a hospital for a few hours and then come back and tell me that your water's at the wrong temperature.
That's a very good point, Jonathan. And I know that some of the conference interpreters tend to be a bit of a prima donnas, especially when in terms of how they like to be perceived and how they like to be treated, and all of that. And I probably wouldn't find many public service interpreters with the same level of self-perception that some of the conference interpreters have. So you're really right on that. But let me develop this idea of how our profession is perceived, because this transformation or this pandemic has deeply affected how interpreters are seen. And many of my older colleagues or many of the conference interpreters opposed remote interpreting, specifically because they believe that by removing the interpreter from the room, by taking the booth, even into the lobby outside or even to the next floor, you are basically affecting the status. You are reducing the status of interpreters by taking the interpreters out of the equation from the room. We are invisible and therefore less relevant and therefore less important. Now we are all removed from the equation. We are nowhere to be found in conference rooms. The booths have disappeared. They've gone virtual. And the same happened to public service interpreting in those places that are equipped with the ability to provide remote interpreting or video reinterpreting. What do you think, or how do you see the impact this has on the perception of our profession from the side of our clients? How will our clients perceive us now that we are no longer physically there? Because it can have negative and positive repercussions? Whoever would like to answer first.
I
Shall
need
I
to go and
go,
get.
or-
Yeah, I'm going to let Raquel go because I just need to grab something off my bookshelf. Give me a second.
Well, actually, it already happens with telephone interpreters that there are clients who think they are machines. And yeah, this sometimes happens. There actually people are not equally perceptive about how language works and how actually machines speak. So there are people who may be speaking with a bot and they might think that is a person, and it happens the other way around too. So there are actually people who have been speaking well through a telephone interpreter, and they have thought the interpreter was a machine. So this is, well, I don't think this is going to happen so much with conference interpreting, because we are emphasizing all the time that the interpreting services are being provided and the interpreters are there. So we kind of emphasize that there is a person behind that interpreting. It is a little bit more automatic when we do it for public service interpreting, because it is just, well, like very fast communication. But yes, it is going to, I think interpreters are going to gain visibility in that interpreters are going to be more present for interpreting assignments everywhere, for both for conference and for public service interpreting assignments. But that visibility is going to be special in that the interpreter is not going to be seen in any way possible. So with conference interpreters, we could look back and see them inside the booths, see actual people inside the booths. Now we are not going to see them in any possible way. But I think they are going to be more present than ever.
That's very positive. Jonathan.
I like, there's two things I want to say. The first is when you fly in an aircraft, you almost never see the pilot, but you know they're there because before you take off, they say, this is your captain speaking, or this is your first officer. I only semi-jokingly said, well, why don't we have a situation where we make it normal before the chair opens a meeting or before the doctor says something for the interpreter to say, hello, I'm so-and-so, I'm your whatever language interpreter. It's
and the emergency exits are located.
Yeah, you know, but most people connect to a meeting before it starts. If we have a chat and we have a relationship with the client, where possible, we could say, just before the meeting starts, can we quickly say, this is so-and-so and so-and-so, your French interpreter. And we'll be your interpreters today, blah, blah, blah. Please, can you make sure, and do like a very, like, I don't know, 30-second thing of, please, can you make sure that any loud animals or loud children are out of the room and that your incoming sound and outgoing sound are separate. We would like you to use a headset if possible. If you haven't already had that chat, you know, it's good to have that chat again. The other thing is I hate to raise the book again. No, I don't. Please buy it. I have a chapter called How We Wrecked Our Own PR. If anyone is responsible for the invisibility of interpreting, it's us. And so we can't complain about remote interpreting making us invisible when for years we've been saying we're impartial, we're invisible, we never make a difference. I'm sorry, it's the message we've been giving to clients for years, and we can prove that through research. So if we're worried about invisibility, we need to think about our messaging, and we need to think about how we're describing our work, who we're describing our work to, how much time we're spending around potential clients, and all this stuff that I know has been said hundreds of times by hundreds of people, going all the way back to Judy and Dagmar Jenner's book, The Entrepreneurial Linguist, and the importance of being around clients. And so I think that was the 1990s or early 2000s. We can't get away from this. And so if we're worried about remote interpreting making us more invisible, the antidote is to find ways to make ourselves more visible. And it could be quickly just say at the start, hello, I'm so-and-so, your whatever interpreter. It could also be, you know, if you're an interpreter working in medicine, that you find your local medical conference that you're not interpreting at, and you go and visit and you go and hang around the doctors, or you go to some drug manufacturing exhibition or whatever. you be in their world. And if we're waiting for visibility to start in the assignment, we're way too late. In visibility and making people aware of what we do starts before they can even spell the word interpreter, and goes all the way through to how we treat them when we've sent the invoice and they've paid us. I've got a paper coming out where I argue that we've concentrated in interpreting studies on the interpreted event. And that's like, I don't know, a quarter, a tenth of the process. If we start thinking about the wider process of how our interpreters found, hired, scoped, paid, treated, what's the relationship between interpreters and their clients outside of the assignment, there's a whole, Graham Turner back in 2012, I think it was, pointed a whole pyramid of things that go on around interpreting from policy to pay that we just don't look at enough. And so I would say if we want to crack the invisibility problem, we think down that pyramid, we think all the way down and go, how do we become visible to government when they're setting policy? How do we become visible to clients when they're thinking human or machine? How do we become visible to the people making speech interpreting machines and so on? How do we become visible to anyone at any point in the process? And when we think in those terms, we're okay.
Yeah, well, thank you for this. It's a very positive outlook on the issue. I personally, for example, have the experience that the transition to digital or remote interpreting in some aspects even increased the visibility of the profession, because when we are working on Zoom, you can see the interpreter on the, among the participants, and you can chat with the interpreter, and you actually see the name of the interpreter very often, which wasn't the case before. I mean, we would be anonymous, we would be just, faces in the booth. And now you have the chance to interact with the interpreters, sometimes through chat. So my personal experience is that the visibility of interpreters in certain ways, yes, it is reduced. On the other way, we acquired new channels of communicating with the clients, even during the event, that we didn't have before. But visibility of the profession is only one aspect that is being transformed quite deeply. The second is the especially my older colleagues are very much worried about the new risks stemming from remote interpreting, especially the cognitive load, the acoustic shock, and other risks stemming from the nascent technology of online remote conference interpreting. And I'm pretty much sure that the same would apply to public service domain, that simply the ways how we work are still quite fresh, and we don't have that much research on what are the implications on our ears, on our brain in terms of cognitive load. I have recently talked to Andrea Cagneto, discussing his research on acoustic shock and the damage that poor sound quality does to interpreters when working remotely. Do you think that these threats are just, child diseases of a new nascent technology that will be promptly resolved, or do you really think that the transition to a digital conferencing or digital interpreting or remote interpreting is that much different than the traditional analog way of providing interpreting before?
Well, I would say that for public service interpreters used to work on site, when they start working remotely, it is actually very hard. It is what I was saying before, that when you are not used to a particular activity, it is much more tiring. But usually we can get used to that quite quickly. So it is not so, it is very demanding at the beginning, but that we get used to that. And about the acoustic shock, and well, most interpreters are already used to working with headsets, so that shouldn't be a problem. Sound quality is a problem, right? But we can do, I think we've got the tools. I think sound quality was an issue before as well. And what I do think as well is that we have to also train interpreters and provide some guidelines for interpreters for self-care, because there are still many interpreters who do not wear their headsets on both of their ears, for example. And that is a mistake, because, well, many times they think that if they leave one of their ears free, they can monitor what they are saying and that their performance is going to be better, or that, well, they will be more aware of the environment if they're inside a booth and they've got a colleague by their side. But actually that is a mistake, because we know that what happens is that one of our ears is doing the job of both, and well, that is actually not good for our hearing ear. So yeah, we have those things are usually not said inside training programs, or don't know. I think those should be included, and perhaps well, professional associations could sometimes issue some guidelines and distribute them amongst interpreters, just reminding about the risks of the profession, because we discover the risks as well as new challenges are introduced inside the profession and changes happen, then the risks appear. So I think it is a good thing. It would be best practice for instance, professional associations to compile a list of guidelines and just distribute them amongst their interpreters, their affiliated interpreters.
I think also we can't forget that during the before time, there were real risks as well. I can't be the only conference interpreter who's had a speaker kind of start speaking really, really quietly into their microphone, and then suddenly think the microphone wasn't working, tap it really hard. I'm sure we've all had that happen, and we've all had the other speakers where you're like, how high do I have to turn this up before you start making sense? And so those risks have been there. I would say I have 5 children, all of whom are at home right now in another room. I cannot do remote interpreting from home. It's not reasonable for me to do remote interpreting from home. So when I do remote interpreting, it's at a studio about 20 minutes away, just across the bridge in Fife. And I know there someone else, qualified sound techs, are making sure that I don't suffer from acoustic shock. They're doing their best on sound quality. They've got screens set up in a very ergonomic way so that we can, wherever we look, we're seeing the right thing that we want to see in that place. They'll even change over what's on the screens for you if you want. Perhaps we expect too much. I've seen so many guidelines on interpreters' home setup that to me scream, you expect all interpreters to be rich. You know, saying to interpreters, you need a this, a this, a this. You know, I saw one recently saying, you know, it's reasonable for speakers to always be posted £20 USB mics. And I felt like saying, no, it's not always reasonable for the conference organizer to send every speaker a £20 microphone and pay the postage and expect it to arrive on time. That's simply unreasonable. And so I think we perhaps expect too much of interpreters in terms of their equipment budget. And the answer could be, certainly for conference interpreting, to say the standard is that you speak to the client and explain it's way cheaper to send the interpreters to a studio than it is to bring the studio to the conference. So if you're going to have a remote conference, the professional recommendation is that you pay for the interpreters to be in their local professional studio. And that eliminates most of the risks straight away, because if it's a good studio, they know what they're doing. And that's probably not reasonable for public service interpreting. But then I've just said that we should stop, you know, that we should blur the boundaries. So perhaps we need to copy sign language interpreting, where interpreting centers were growing before the pandemic, and start saying, well, is there money to be made with not just having an RSI studio, but someone setting up an interpreting center that interpreters can go to, and I don't know, pay some sort of basic fee that they can just include in their fees and say, yeah, I'm going to the interpreting center where I know I'll be looked after. I know there will be tea and coffee. I know that I won't get acoustic shock because there's a sound tech there. You know, we should be pushing for these standards to be developed and not expecting that every interpreter is going to have a £3,000 laptop, a £200 headset, and a microphone that looks like it's just come off the radio.
That's a very good point. And I myself have read multiple shopping lists that you need to sort of follow, you know, if you want to provide good sound quality and have a professional sound. And really, I mean, I would be in deep deficit if I would invest in all of those technologies, especially in the early days of remote interpreting. But Raquel, Jonathan has touched upon a very interesting issue, that It's one thing to fight for standards in the field of conference interpreting, when you can actually reasonably expect the conference organizers to provide a certain quality of sound, and you can, endlessly talk about the importance of speakers having earphones and speaking into the microphone rather than just, yelling at the laptop. But it's totally different in, for example, in medical setting. I cannot imagine, imposing on hospital staff the obligation to wear earphones and talking to a proper microphone. If, at least as I imagine it, you often end up, using just the phone that you have with all the background noise, or perhaps a tablet at best with all the background noise and all the other problematic aspects that come along with this type of communication. So what are the risks for public service interpreting with, acoustic, not only just acoustic shock, but with hearing damage, and also the ability to concentrate if you can hear all the other surrounding noises, and can really, it is very difficult to isolate the message that you need to work with.
Yes, actually, well, that is a great challenge for public service interpreters. Well, many of our clients are not used to working with interpreters, so they do not know how sound works. And yes, it is true that sometimes they just have a smartphone and they put it on a table and they start speaking to it, all of them. And this is, yes, this is very challenging. What we do, well, telephone interpreting companies develop protocols, and they do this together with their clients, right? With the medical service, for instance, and they develop a protocol and they establish what is needed so that sound quality is, well, optimal. But then those protocols transfer to the workers of that particular institution. And usually what happens is that, well, many times those workers, well, they use interpreters only a few times if we consider the whole amount of work that they have. So when they come to use an interpreter, then they don't know how to do it, but it gets better after they've been working with interpreters for a while. So those standards are standards, so to say, those are protocols, right? Those protocols are developed by telephone interpreting companies. Then, well, we've got plenty of standards, ISO standards, which apply both for on-site and remote interpreting in public service settings. And this is also tackled. I think it is more a matter of clients getting used to working with interpreters. And an advantage of public service interpreting is that it is interactive. So actually interpreters can interrupt the main speakers and say, I cannot hear. Are you using the smartphone this way? Try doing this, try doing that. Or for instance, well, sometimes it happens that now that we are telecommuting, that we've got the worker who's phoning someone using video conferencing, and he's taking the phone and the phone is on the computer. So the interpreter gets the sound, the aerial sound for the service provider, but the computer sound from the end user. This is a nightmare. And you have to add that the service provider is typing. Yes, it is awful. The interpreter has to stop the conversation and say, I cannot listen. Oh, and it also happens, and this is quite fun too, that they put the phone inside a plastic bag. Yeah, it is more hygienic. Yeah, so the interpreters are listening to all that crunching. And well, those are practices that we discover, like, why are we hearing that much crunching? And suddenly they tell you, oh no, we've put the smartphone inside a plastic bag. And then you realize, and it's like, okay, we have to include this inside the protocol, and we have to distribute further guidelines so that service providers don't put telephones inside plastic bags. But yeah, the advantage is that interpreters at least can tell the main speakers, and they can stop the communication and say, I need this and this, so that this is at least possible. Perhaps it is not going to be the best, they are not going to be the best conditions, but at least minimal conditions, so that well, the assignment can be performed.
Raquel, you need to record a short 5-minute YouTube video called The Life and Struggles of a Remote Public Service Interpreter. And I will use it to share with my colleagues who, complain about sound quality if the speaker is not 25 but 35 centimeters away from his microphone, and they complain that that they have a variability in the sound level by 10%, and they actually are bothered by having to use their arm and turning the knob on the volume up and down if needed. So that would be really appreciated, and perhaps the prima donnas of conference interpreting would at least slightly appreciate the quality of sound that they are getting. So that
I already have a YouTube channel called Inside Interpreting. So Raquel, if you make that, I will volunteer to edit the footage and put that on YouTube for you. If you send me the raw footage, I will edit it and put it on YouTube. Inside Interpreting, go look it up. Yeah, because I'm used to editing. That is just, conference interpreters complain when your booth mate brings a packet of crisps into the booth because it's disturbing. Now, I mean, obviously you should never eat crisps in the booth for numerous reasons. But yes, that puts our complaints about, oh no, my booth mate bought crisps, that just puts it into the shade.
Looking into the future, where do you see interpreting in 5 years? I mean, obviously, if I gave you this question 2 years ago, none of us would ever guess how deeply the profession will be transformed. Although I do realize now that the public service interpreting was way ahead of conference interpreting in terms of provision of services remotely. So in that way, you were better prepared than conference interpreters for the transformation. But looking into a crystal ball and taking the daring step of being a prophet of what's going to happen in the next 5 years, how do you think the profession will be transformed? Do you think there will be more interpreting, both public service and conference, given the availability of the service, and given the lack of, or given the fact that now you don't have to bring booths and pay technicians and borrow the little headsets, now that basically the provision, the technical availability of interpreting is much cheaper than before in terms of conference interpreting. But the same applies to public service interpreting, because now you can handle or serve clients all over Spain from your home, and you are no longer limited by the physical distance from the client. So do you think that the digitalization or the availability of remote interpreting will increase the total amount of interpreting, or will we see a stagnation in terms of demand, and also in terms of recognition for the profession, because interpreters will just become some noises in the background and everyone will end up using poor English instead? So what is your gut feeling on how the profession will evolve, and how the interpreter of the third decade of the new millennium will look like? What is going to be the profession, the standard professional in 2029, 2028?
I would start with a line that I've been developing for a while, which says, in the future, every interpreter will be a consultant. Every interpreter will have to be able to talk to clients and say, in this situation, here's a good solution. In this situation, here's a good solution. In this because, and we had a debate about this on Twitter, and I don't think people quite got where I was going for a while. We have to get used to the reality that interpreting and translation are no longer the only means of producing content in more than one language. I came across an article from Ottawa recently in Canada, where instead of interpreting their campaign to get people to get the vaccine, they empowered people within local communities to go and do presentations to their communities. They gave them like a toolkit. They gave them and say, you know, here are some points we'd like you to hit, but we want you to present your angle on how to do this. With the rise of automated speech translation, often called machine interpreting by people who don't know what interpreting is, with the rise of remote interpreting, with in-person interpreting slowly coming back, with community, with people talking about generating content within a community and generating things within a community, I think we need to get used to interpreting being one solution among several, especially for things like, you know, public health campaigns and things like that. Interpreting is going to be a possible solution. And so I think the interpreter of tomorrow is going to be an awful lot like the sign language interpreter of today. I joke with people, if you want to know where spoken language interpreting will be in 5 years' time, look at where sign language interpreting is today. I recently had the honour of speaking at the conference of the European Federation of Sign Language Interpreters, and I found that sign language interpreters are very technology aware, very technology savvy. They've been doing remote interpreting even before public service, from around the same time as public service interpreting was. They're very connected to the communities for whom and because of whom they interpret, and they're very connected to understanding that if you push interpreting as the solution, you're ultimately disempowering the community that for whom you exist. And so can we get to a place where consultant interpreters become, I don't know, language and communication consultants, and know when interpreting is the best, human interpreting is the best solution, when avatars and other technologies are the best solution, when to be remote, when to be in person. And can we have the conversation with clients that empowers the clients to take ownership of their communication? In conference interpreting, we've been so used to telling clients what the standards are that I wonder whether this pandemic and the growth of remote interpreting is a wake-up call to take a step back and go, rather than telling, can we empower and can we work with clients? I don't know, like management consultants do, or like marketing consultants do. We're not doing the work for you, but we're here to guide you through the process of getting the work right. That's a whole set of training. I don't know that many interpreters who are going that broad. You know, I tell people interpreters belong in the boardroom. Because if you're going to be talking to someone about their entire communication strategy or how to deal with this communication problem, you can't do that at assignment by assignment level. You do that by talking with the leadership of the organization. And we've seen some experiences of that in Scotland, how things can change when you talk to the right people. So yeah, that's where I take the interpreting is going to be bigger, broader. It's going to be one solution among many. And the interpreters who are graduating this year are going to be consultants, probably within the first 2 or 3 years of them finishing, who have to know remote interpreting, automated speech translation, communication production, who have to know all that stuff. It's daunting, but it's going to be incredibly powerful.
Raquel?
Yes, I agree. But I would introduce another item inside that system. Well, I think it is just natural, right? Because just remember what happens with translation industry, that we started introducing in universities. We started introducing content about project management because translators had to cater for many other activities and many times had to be consultants and project managers. Well, this is also happening with interpreting. It is true that we are asked for more abilities, more skills. We will need to adapt to different situations, and we will have to consider communication as a whole. So not just interpretation, but making communication possible. But also, I think that if we tell for our graduates at university, you will have to do this and this and this and this. It is so overwhelming. I think there is going to be a stratification of the profession. So there are going to be interpreters who are going to be able to be consultants, and this will happen with time. So perhaps you're going to be a consultant after 10 years of being a plain interpreter. And the profession is going to get more complicated. I don't know if the title interpreter is going to be the most adequate one. I don't know, because I also think that we're going to do plenty of things apart from interpreting. But I think that not every interpreter is going to be a consultant, that there is going to be, well, a scale, a whole system. We're going to have interpreters who are going to provide advice for others. If we take, for instance, into consideration languages of lesser diffusion, we're going to have interpreters who perhaps haven't followed higher education, but we also need them for certain assignments. So perhaps they are going to follow instructions and guidelines and supervision from other senior interpreters.
That's a very good point, especially in the field of public service interpreting. The ability to train professionals in the traditional sense is almost impossible if we talk about languages of lesser diffusion, or languages which are not really that common in Europe, like Farsi, for example, where multiple countries are struggling to obtain a sufficient number of public service interpreters. But to conclude, this is, and I'm glad that you agree on the vision that perhaps we shouldn't even call it, interpreting studies anymore. We should talk about intercultural communication or mediators of intercultural communication, as the scope of activities is so broad. And I'm glad that we are brave enough to think about the future of interpreting, not only in the traditional framework of interpreting, but even outside of it, because the era of one profession for life is probably over, and even during an individual's lifetime, you will probably evolve, trying several different angles or trying several different approaches to intercultural communication, where the main narrative of enabling communication between different languages or between different people will remain, but the methods of implementing it in practice will be different. Becoming a conference interpreter in the traditional setting for some part of your career or some time in your professional life, and then focusing on transcreation or different channels of communicating, even textual messages, or even intersemiotic communication from different angles. So that might be the name or the agenda for training of future professionals in the years to come. So thank you very much for your ideas. We've just finished the allocated time for our roundtable. Unfortunately, we did not have the ability to offer our audience a chance to ask questions, as this was pre-recorded. But I think that the wealth and depth of inspiration and ideas from both of you is quite overwhelming. So there is a lot to process. At least I have some ideas that I'd like to develop now and then talk with my colleagues about on how to update our training structure at the Comenius University. So thank you for that. I wish you good luck. Less mobile phones in plastic bags, and more aware clients about what the needs and abilities of interpreters are, and what the technical standards of providing our services should be. So thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Have a pleasant afternoon, and I hope to meet you in person, hopefully someday soon. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.